Hello, and welcome to the G'day USA dialogue on the future of entertainment. My name is Jane Duke, and I'm Australia's Consul General in Los Angeles. It's a privilege to be here today with some incredible Australians at the very forefront of the US entertainment industry. This past year, we've seen the devastating human and economic impacts caused by COVID-19. Many industries were affected, including entertainment. Theatres, live music, and stadiums had to close down suddenly, and film and TV productions had to confront challenges brought about by uncertain stop-starts and lengthy delays in operations. At the same time, streaming services and digital consumption spurred an insatiable demand for content. Gaming continued its trajectory as the most expansive category in the entertainment industry, with some 2.5 billion gamers around the world connecting, socializing, and playing with their friends. Many experts have observed that COVID-19 accelerated and amplified long-running changes in consumer habits and preferences. Technology and new platforms, including social media, are playing their part in revolutionizing developments. Today, we will hear more about these trends. The global media and entertainment industry is enormous. Revenue back in 2018 was over $2.1 trillion, and the US is the largest market in the world, representing around a third of the global total. Australia has outsized influence in the creative industries in the US. For decades, many Australians have come to the US to be a part of this massive market. We're proud of their success, which is also a great asset in our soft diplomacy. In recent times, we're seeing that creative connection boomerang back to Australia, furthering our cultural ties. In the movies, we're seeing major film studios invest in a pipeline of production, and A-list stars like George Clooney, Julia Roberts, Natalie Portman, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and Zac Efron, just to name a few, part of the talent coming to Australia. It's led to the media calling the influx Aussiewood. And in live theatre, Broadway musical smash hit Hamilton opened to a sellout crowd in Sydney this last week. Hamilton's original producer, Jeffrey Seller, travelled from New York to be there for the occasion and said how energising and inspiring it was to be in Sydney and see live theatre again. So now, as the world opens back up, let's hear more from our speakers about their vision for the future of entertainment. It's my pleasure to introduce Graeme Mason, CEO of Screen Australia, who'll be moderating the discussion today. Graeme has over 30 years of international experience in film, television, and multimedia businesses, including in the US, the UK, and New Zealand. He is one of Australia's most influential and outstanding leaders. Graeme, over to you.
Thanks very much, Consul. That's a very generous and lovely welcome. From that note, I know moderators often say this, that we really have an extraordinary group of people with us today, but we really do. And I think one of the most exciting things for me, and hopefully for all of you, will be the range of their interests and activities. And really what I hope we can give for you today is a little bit of where we've been, where we are now, but I think these people are leading the way for where we're possibly all going to be. Really, it is the future of entertainment. So with the caliber of them, if this is a good session, I would expect it to be, it's all down to them. If it isn't, then it's all my fault. So from that, just running through in alphabetical order, I want to introduce Greg Basser. So he's the CEO of Gentle Giant Media, but Greg, again, has a very long and varied career, but particularly of interest to me in the motion picture industry. So in almost traditional sense, I mean, coming from Village Roadshow, which here in Australia is the largest exhibition distribution entity. They're also the most supportive of Australian films. They own studio space, but Greg really moved them into being a global entity based in the US, huge deals with studios, billions of dollars of productions and box office. But also very interesting to me that since he set up his own company, he's interested in production, but he's also very keen in giving back and doing a lot of work in the US and here with us on the next generation. Sarah Harden, Hello Sunshine. Again, fantastic Australian, goes out, works in Asia, works in the US. particularly fascinating to me is the new thing at Hello Sunshine, where she, with her colleague Reese Witherspoon, are really into disciplines of what entertainment really means, from book clubs to consumers to multiple different screens that they're looking at. So really looking at that hybrid of where the intersection is for entertainment content, where it comes from and where it can go. Carmen, Pavlovic, really excited about this because Global Creatures, the CEO and owner of the company, an amazing live theatre entity that, again, Carmen has worked all over the world, but she's worked in those hotspots for live theatre, which traditionally are London and New York. But what she has managed to set up is she's worked all over the world, having put on things in Russia, Italy, France, Germany. The first company, I think, Carmen, the first Australians to actually ever have anything on Broadway originating from here, which is extraordinary. And that was the same time, in fact, you ended up with several shows on Broadway at once. I'm quite fascinated again because a lot of those things have come from my part of the world, like Moulin Rouge, obviously. So it's that intersectionality of where does content come from and where could it go and what are consumers looking for. Ending with Andrew Wilson. Now, electronic arts, it's hard to overstate the importance of what has happened with games and their place in creating content, which comes back into my traditional forms, being the other way forward, whether it be the digital changes literally in how things are made, which influences across. So I think Andrew is going to be able to talk a lot about future where audiences are looking in form and format. So with that in mind, I'm going to make this a bit of a conversation. What I wanted to talk about for all of you is change. Obviously, let's not cover COVID just yet. Let's come back to that. Generally, I want everyone to recognise that whilst not unique, and so I'd look at things like retail, which have fundamentally shifted with Amazon and that whole chain of how things are made and got out to consumers. But I'm not sure that necessarily the audience listening to us today understand how much our sector has changed totally. The way things are funded, produced, distributed, their long tail, in every way, shape or form, I think that has changed because people consume content differently than they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago. So I'm going to start actually almost with the person who people would think is probably the least impacted by that, but I'm not sure that's true, which would be Carmen. I'm keen to think about how has live theatre and audiences for that changed in these years?
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. It's a good question because, of course, my mind immediately went to COVID as you were talking about that. But if we step away from COVID context for a minute, so for years now, we have been seeing this kind of bigger move to conceiving 360-degree content. So if we look at something like Muriel's Wedding is a good example for me, was a feature film. We licensed the rights to create a stage musical of that, which we did with an original score. And it's not impossible. And indeed, we do think about, well, what are the further lives for this new musical format we've created? There's a cast album recording. It's not inconceivable that that the book and score of the stage musical couldn't go on to become a movie musical as well. So we think about a whole lot of subsidiary exploitations then in terms of stock and amateur, school groups, etc. So that's just been a growing trend. Of course, I'm going to break your rule and mention COVID because, of course, we saw a big uptick in live streaming during the last year, but that actually also paralleled another development where we're seeing the idea of live capture increase. So by live capture, I mean the shooting of a show in its context in the theatre with an audience. And so probably the closest, most recent example was Hamilton, which premiered on Disney+. And I think just a combination of Hamilton doing that extraordinary deal with Netflix, and that the last year of COVID has probably got everybody thinking more about live capture and having that very much planned early in thinking about future exploitation of rights. So I think we'll see more of that as far as theatre goes. I know certainly in the last year, I mean, if I had $1 for every time someone's called me saying, now have you thought about doing a live capture of Moulin Rouge? But then that's the kind of probably stuff you'd be expecting to hear. The stuff that's sort of more interest to me at the moment is looking at what I think of as a kind of participation of fans and audience in wanting to kind of collaborate with the content. So there's been, for me, some fascinating examples in the recent year, even on TikTok. So, you know, I think of a show like Beetlejuice that opened on Broadway, didn't necessarily have such great critical acclaim or box office, yet in their Tony broadcast, something in one of the numbers that was performed captured a TikTok audience imagination. It really took off. It meant that people were posting TikToks, and so suddenly the Beetlejuice cast album became this massive thing, and that then translated to the show on Broadway finding this whole new audience and actually suddenly having a very big uptick at the box office. And then finally, I think of something like TikTok, Ratatouille, the TikTok musical. So I don't know if you followed that last year, that you know, this young woman, Emma, posted a little tribute to one of the characters, and it just captured the imagination of a Broadway composer and orchestrator who then created his own little TikTok of her song, and suddenly 130 people had posted their own TikToks of this song, and before you knew it, that had grown into this whole movement of Ratatouille, the TikTok musical, and then that was live streamed as a full musical in January with Lucy Moss, the director of Six, directing it. It raised $2 million for the Actors Fund. Now Disney are kind of supporting it online, and we're not going to be surprised at all, I think, if we see that become the path of a new production on Broadway, generated very much by fans. So, and now more recently, Clubhouse, you know, I'm hearing people start to sort of develop content on Clubhouse, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what is this Clubhouse thing? And what are these concerts that people are working on there? So yeah, for me, the biggest shift is really around the fan collaboration and participation in the making of content.
So Sarah, it'd be interesting to hear from you, because obviously both when you're at Otter, but now particularly Hello Sunshine, your whole thing is looking 360 at how consumers are going to consume content, what it's for. Your thoughts on the change in the sector more broadly?
Yeah, look, I think what you've seen in the last 10 years, and with the move, I think streaming, direct-to-consumer streaming has been a big part of it, where the consumer really is in control, right? And I think both you've had many more outlets where there isn't there's not as many structural gatekeepers in the way between a piece of content. It doesn't have to, you know, the gatekeeper is the streaming platform. And at the same time, you've seen if you really look at the competitive landscape, it's exploded, because, you know, you're not just competing for the attention of trying to get someone into a movie seat, but, you know, you are competing for the attention for Snapchat and social media and gaming. There's only so many hours in a day. And so when you think about that, and the sort of talk about peak content and peak, there's never been more choices. Consumers have a proliferation of choices. And so what does that mean for content creators? In many ways, it's a great time for content creators, but it's incredibly crowded, the landscape. And so, you know, even when you look at platforms like, you know, a Netflix or an Amazon or any of the streaming platforms, like, even standing out within those platforms can be a challenge, to the extent you get a show funded and on there. And so I think it's like, it gives rise to a whole lot of different set of capabilities that you need to have. And I think for us at Hello Sunshine, you know, we only started the company, you know, sort of formally about 4 years ago, trying to think through how do you stand out in a very crowded marketplace. And, you know, for us, we have, you know, we're a mission-driven company, a commitment to putting women at the center of every narrative. So there's a curatorial expectation of what to expect from us as a brand, and generating a lot of what we do, our storytelling, from books as well. And so, you know, we have a direct relationship with consumers, as well as producing premium content that we're then partnering with people to get out in the world. And that's part of a sort of strategy about how do you get cut through in an incredibly crowded marketplace.
I think, Andrew, this is the perfect moment to ask you that question, because Carmen, Greg and Sarah, even though they work on a lot of things, it's still much more finite than in your world. you probably are in the same place as Reed Hastings from Netflix, who said the real competition they've got is time. It's the consumer's time is the challenge. How do you find that volume? How do you encourage cut through? How is it that you guys stand out so much and change more broadly? And what's your view on all this?
Yeah, I would echo some of my colleagues here thoughts. I think, when I think about change on three vectors: discovery, purchase, and enjoyment. And I think what has been said already is that the nature of discovery now is more complicated than it's ever been, because there's more content to discover than there ever has. And the digital ecosystem actually hasn't presented a great format for you to find things that are really meaningful to you. And so a lot of it becomes community driven, and network value has real importance. And in a network world, scale matters. And so that's why we're seeing some of the bigger players like Disney, like Netflix, demand a lot more discovery than some of the smaller companies in the ecosystem. And the same is true in our industry. It's getting harder and harder for a small indie game company to be discovered. Not impossible, but more complicated. I think the second vector is purchase, and that again has changed. What we see anytime the cloud comes into any industry, not just entertainment, but anything, is consumer orientation moves from ownership to access. And once that shift happens, then the business model that almost always rises to the top or rises to the surface is subscription. And we're seeing that in music, and we're seeing that in movies and television, we're seeing that in games, we're seeing that across many different ecosystems. And in a subscription-based environment, it offers a consumer the ability to interact with a lot of things that they otherwise wouldn't. So it represents a significant opportunity for creators to get content to their consumers. But as we all know, in the context of a subscription world, the economics for creators is different than it was in a pre-subscription world. And I think that's something that we as an entertainment industry will continue to wrestle with, is how do we ensure that content creators retain the value in the creations they make, versus moving that value to the platforms, those that aggregate audiences. And then the last thing is enjoyment. And I think there's a number of different vectors of this. High quality content continues to rise to the top. But almost certainly our player base, we have 500 million people in our network. There's about 3 billion people on the planet that play games. They want more player agency in the nature of things that they play and how they play them and who they play them with. And so we are far less able to direct an experience in the way we did, 10, 15 or 20 years ago. And that goes even further now when you think of things like, user-generated content in our ecosystem. And this is, we've seen this in YouTube, and we've seen this in GarageBand, and we've seen it in other industries, but it's started to rise up in our industry. That's the democratization of the creation of content. And what we know from YouTube and what we know from GarageBand is, there's not that many Beatles out there, and there are not that many Steven Spielbergs, but there are a few. But intermixing, user-generated content with, content created by professionals in this field, and then giving our audiences agency over how they consume that and how they interact with that, is a really, really big deal and a big shift for us. And it means for whether you're a musician or a director or an actor or a video game creator, we now have to give over a lot more ownership of the experience to our consumer. And that's very unnatural for us. And it creates a more problematic creative ecosystem and creative process. But the ability for us to engage more deeply and engage more people is almost exponential as a result of that shift.
So leading on from that, Greg, maybe I'm going to throw to you. I'm quite interested about, what do you think all these shifts mean for the very expensive world of traditional film and television driven production? And it's probably, Carmen's the same thing. Where are we all going to be in this place?
It's a real dilemma, as Andrew rightly pointed out, is that if we are relying on just streaming, particularly in motion picture and theatrical, the economics are really difficult. Films aren't getting that much cheaper to make. People are demanding. I think that the rise of social media, and in particular in the film industry, Rotten Tomatoes, has meant that you no longer have the ability to make something that doesn't quite work. You market it and you can open it on a weekend and no one knew about really what they thought about it. until Monday morning, and it became Saturday. Then now it's become half an hour on films open in the US on a Friday, but they'll do previews at 7 o'clock at night. By 7:30, everybody knows about that film, whether it's good, bad, or different. So for me, that's a really great thing for the industry, because it's a flight to quality. Cream always rises to the top. So we've had to make much better content, more engaging, better made content, but that doesn't come cheap, right? I think for the feature industry, and I know you didn't want to go into COVID too much, but COVID sort of puts a question mark in everybody's mind. What does it mean about theatres? What happens? Where do we go from here? As a content creator, particularly of features, I've always tried to be platform agnostic. And I think the more opportunities there are for us to distribute our content, the more revenue there is. And actually, we've seen that. Films that we might have opened in the late 90s and said, oh, we lost a little bit of money on that, have now made a lot of money, 20 years later, 25 years later, suddenly the revenue kept on coming. But as we saw in the global financial crisis, when bricks and mortar retail disappeared and it really attacked the physical part of our business, that accelerated digital. And there was a lot of noise at the time about, well, hang on, you're not getting nearly as much in what we called home entertainment video than we did in the past. But when you did the economics and drilled down, our margins were significantly higher. And when you're selling something for $15 instead of $30, but your actual takeout as a producer went up about $1 a unit, that was fantastic for our industry. Everyone thought cinemas would go away. They didn't go away. Rotten Tomatoes comes along and says you can no longer cheat through marketing. You've actually got to make something that people want to see. The thing that I see is fantastic for the industry, I think, is that COVID is going to cause a shrinking of the windows. And therefore, the average film runs for no more than 4 weeks. This idea that you then hold back access to that product to the general public for 3, 4, 5, 6 months is crazy. And it's crazy, I think, financially. And I think this is going to help us. Cinemas will open up again fully when people are comfortable, when everyone's vaccinated, and they still want to go out. And we've seen this for decades. The death knell for cinema has been rung, or the bell's been rung, I don't know, a dozen times since I've been in this industry for about 30 years. And it always comes out because going to the cinema is more than just consuming content, it's going out with your friends. If you live in a big city where you're in an apartment, 2 or 3 bedroom apartment with your family, you don't want to be home all the time. So people will still go out. But I think what's going to happen is we're going to recognize there are people who don't go to the movies. If you have kids, you don't go to the movies until your kids are about 5 or 6 because you're home wanting to see them. And it's just too costly, including babysitting and all that sort of stuff. They're an untapped audience for us. And I still think people want to see good content on a big screen. They'll go out and they're not going to not go and consume it because in 2 months' time it's available. That'll add economics into the theatrical business because you're not sort of stop-starting in your marketing once. So for me, I think good content is always going to have a home. I think the economics are going to be there. I do wonder at what's going to happen with the streamers and their dollars at their. When you think about what Netflix spends on content, it's a multiple of what any individual major studio spends on theatrical and TV, and potentially it's more than the majors all spend together.
What
So
I'd like to pick up,
yeah.
I was just going to say, I'd like to pick up with all of you from that. I think there's an opportunity. I think the audience would love to hear from you 4 Australians who've all gone out into the world and worked globally. But it feels to me one thing that maybe, Andrew, you've touched on, particularly the consumer's going to drive this. The consumer is now everywhere, as are the creators. So I'm assuming all of you could work with an Australian, though you're based in America, or Carmen's based here. She could be working with someone from London. Where do you think the opportunity is now for creators to partner together, whatever country they're in? So, I mean, Andrew, your view on, again, how do Americans and Australians, for example, work together better in this moment?
Yeah, and I know we're not at COVID yet, but I think it's an interesting example. So we have a bit better than 10,000 people in our company. Typically, we have them spread across 60 offices and/or studios on a global basis, with big hubs in major areas where we have kind of more than 1,000 people. On March 15 of last year, we shut the entire company down and went from having 60 offices to having effectively 10,000 offices. Including, motion capture at home and music recording at home and creative generation at home and a whole bunch of things that previously we would have thought were impossible to do remote or impossible to do apart. And, the reality is there is a kinetic energy that comes from putting creative people together in a room or a building. You can't escape that. We've seen it time and time again for decades. And I don't expect that kinetic energy will go away. But what we have seen through technology and pure human ingenuity is an ability to do some pretty amazing things. We as a company launched 13 games last year and more than 350 live service updates, so major updates to existing games in the marketplace. And we did all of that with people sitting in 10,000 different offices. And so, for me, who grew up in this industry, who have believed that, teams always had to be together and to harness that power, that kinetic energy. I think that we are now rethinking that, and we will almost certainly have teams work across geographic lines. We'll almost certainly have teams work, in some part or in wholly remote. And I think notwithstanding time zones, which continue to present a challenge with respect to Australia and North America, I have to believe there will be an opportunity for much deeper global collaboration as a result of what we've learned over the last 12 months. And what, quite frankly, we're not going back to offices anytime soon, certainly not this year in any meaningful way. So by the time we start to return, we'll have been doing this thing for 2 years. We will have well and truly learned and built new muscles around creative collaboration. And I have to imagine that will give us the potential to unlock significantly broader partnerships between the US and Australia, which again, as we joked about in the pre-session, is great for me because it gives me a reason to come home more. But we're actively looking at those opportunities.
In fact, again, for everyone watching, Andrew, we can skate here a bit for Australia that, Carmen and I are actually in our offices as we speak. So in Australia, we are back in our offices. And I think, Andrew, you said your first office to open is your one in Melbourne.
Yes.
But,
yeah.
Carmen, I'm keen talking about the idea that sometimes that people think it's harder to work across the countries than it is. You've been dealing with New York from Sydney remotely. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so we are an Australian-based company. We have an office in New York and we have an office in London. And to be honest, the whole shutdown last year, as far as our Australian head office went, it didn't, we all started working from home, but it just didn't really change much from the point of view that we've always been fairly mobile, and the whole company's IT system was set up to be able to work in this format anyway. I travel a lot. In 2018, I just moved my kids and my husband and I, we lived in New York for the year because that was just easier because we were opening 2 productions over there. But otherwise, I generally just do the rough commute between Sydney, LA, New York, London as required. And, our company is very much founded on this idea of international collaboration. I'm not going to pretend it's seamless or that it isn't easy. We regularly, I'm regularly at my desk by at least 7 a.m. for the start of our conference calls with the US, and indeed often earlier. But we very much structured our company day to start early so that we can have that time with the US each day. But, like Andrew's just talked about, over last year, we managed to keep a number of productions. Broadway shut down. We couldn't open Moulin Rouge on the West End as planned. We had 5 productions actually that we would have opened this year around the world. So all of those got shut down, apart from Moulin Rouge will be opening in Melbourne later this year, and hopefully Broadway reopening in September. So we keep the work going. I do find you can't replace being in the room, but our company has been founded on this idea of international collaboration at the outset. So COVID's, shifted that a bit, but not dramatically, not at its core. Like Andrew mentioned, our new policy going forward is that you do have 1 day a week work from home. Everybody works from home on a Thursday. We've certainly discovered we can do a lot more without having to fly theatre designers here to do a recce of the theatre. We can actually do that by Zoom. So there's, some shifts at the margin, but fundamentally we are based in Australia, operate internationally. And I think it's very doable. And we've often built creative teams who are partly American, partly Australian in their constructions or English, but, the point being internationally mixed team to do the work. And it's Graeme, sorry, I feel like I've said a lot to say not very much in that answer, but one thing that I do find often, it's very notable to me how surprising people find that in boardrooms in New York and London. And I do see this sort of puzzling look between people's eyes, kind of going, you come from where? Like what you're doing these 4 shows around the world at the moment, and or just this sort of nervousness about picking up the phone to just cold call because I can't quite get their head around the time zones, even though I go, there's world clock, just do yourself a favor and get it on your phone. So we just kind of roll with it, but I do find a lot of people we deal with internationally find it a sort of perplexing concept.
Brilliant segue. In fact, I'm very keen all of us, obviously we come from Australia, we lived and worked all over the world, and I know people find that weird, the way we think about distance in a different way. But Sarah and Greg, I'm particularly keen because both you and I, we three coming out of more traditional output. When I worked for Universal, it was all about America really, and maybe a little bit about the UK. Whereas it just feels to me now that everybody realizes it's a global business. And Sarah, I'm thinking when you've worked in multiple places and focused on different regions, what do you think about the global nature of the business now and what that means going forward?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. I think if you think about archaic structures, when you really look back at media and how media was managed globally, right, it made no sense where, it was all about, licensing rights on a territory by territory basis. So just remember back to the early days of streaming, you didn't have you had and we didn't have the same level of social media, but if you launch a movie in America on a certain date, someone in Australia has to wait 4 months for it, but the campaign's all over. So and what you realized, and I really realized this when I was living in Hong Kong and we were looking at the anime market, and we ended up acquiring this company Crunchyroll and building out this when I was at Otter, and it was sort of the opportunity came up because anime is a global content category, right? But the rights had been exploited in archaic ways, so there was an opportunity to knit together a business there and a brand there that recognized good content crosses global boundaries. Now, some content does better than others. Comedy translates a little more difficultly, but what's happened with the rise of the streamers, what they started doing is licensing on a global basis. And it makes a lot of sense. So what does that mean? I think if you were going to get cut through in today's day and age, and by the way, Andrew, I think you're winning the attention battle if my patterns of my 15 and 11-year-olds in COVID have been any indication. But if you want to win a attention battle, you launch content into a cultural conversation now on social. And so I think we're at an opportunity which does recognize, and I think it's really good for Australia, because while you are still in an era where, if a streaming player, they are looking at whether a piece of content is going to resonate in the US marketplace, because still a predominance of their subs are US. But as you look at them building out their global sub bases, you see more and more locally commissioned programming in other territories that's coming back in. But I will tell you, all the conversations here are around US, Canada, UK and Australia, because there is a commonality of, it drives meaningful additional economics, and there is a real commonality of media taste and consumption. And I think you're seeing that wide and even globally, it just becomes a relanguaging question in many cases. So I think that genie's out of the bottle, and it's recognizing, I think, like a structural oddity in the way we grew up in media, in the way media was licensed and distributed.
I mean, I will say, just because of the size of the market here, and for us as a company, we don't replicate West End and Broadway licenses. We don't license and replicate. We create new work here to take to the world. So we've always had to conceive what the international potential of a story is, and whether it's universal in its themes, and just how far it will travel. Because it's just not economically viable for us to put all the investment into a new musical like Muriel's Wedding if we really thought its life only existed in Australia. I think that challenge is just going to grow as more markets open up around the world, but certainly that's at the core of the way we conceive work.
Greg, I'm very keen for you to talk about this too, but especially to give you another line for those who are watching this. I mean, obviously you're all aware that Australia has so many stars in the entertainment field, both on and off screen, but particularly on screen. I mean, I think per capita, we've just got more stars than you can possibly imagine for a small country. So I'm interested, Greg, in why you think that is, but B, what is the opportunity in this more global landscape to not just have Hemsworth, Nicole, Kate, Hugh, Margot, etc. What's the opportunity for businesses in the screen sector, as well? Producers, businesses, obviously, which you are one.
Can you hear me, Graeme? My internet's locked up a bit, but I'll keep talking, I think. Can you hear me, Graeme?
We can hear you.
Okay. Look, just as a quick point, I think the film industry has actually had to address the globalization, internationalization of audiences much sooner than TV and other forms of media, because of the way that we marketed it was, and the cost meant that the only way you actually recoup your costs and made a profit was to play wide, in 127 countries. And so the big advantage we had when we set up Village Roadshow Pictures was, through our experience in running cinemas around the world, we got to understand what audiences wanted to see. So, and that happened around about 2000. So suddenly, global box office, foreign box office started going past domestic box office and became a real staple for being able to afford films and make films. In terms of Australians, if you like, boxing above their weight, a lot of it's got to do, I think, with our culture. I think the success of Australians in our industry is that we're seen as very easy to work with. And that's, I've always said to people wanting to come into the industry, particularly in Hollywood, be humble. If you're humble, put your head down and do your job, you'll actually participate a lot. And so when you talk to studio executives about whether it's in front or behind the camera about Australians, generally they love working with us because we're easy to work with. We sort of leave our egos at the door a little bit, I think that's something that seems to work. Everyone, if you mention Hugh Jackman, everyone gets a smile on their face because he's, we work with him on a couple of films. He's just a joy to work with, both when you make the film and when you're marketing. And the same goes with all the other people that you've talked about. So I think that's very helpful. One of the things that I think is a great opportunity, I'm sort of going off topic a little bit, but one of the great opportunities for our industry at the moment is, as a result of COVID, there's so many productions down here, as you know. I'm constantly getting calls from people about, who do you know who could be this head of department or that head of department? And that's fantastic, while we are the safest place in the world to make movies. For those of you in America, there's a number of shows that didn't stop for COVID at all. And now we're just overwhelmed in a way. But the opportunity that I see is happening, and I'm getting these calls on a regular basis now, I'm working with US production companies, is finally they've realized that we can tell stories out of Australia, and that there's becoming, it's building at the moment, and I'm seeing it at my level. There's a demand for Australian writers coming. People are saying, hey, I want to make something in Australia. Which writers would you suggest to do X? And I think that's going to be fantastic when we talk about the relationship between the US and Australia. That's what's going to be really great for us. If we can continue to build on that and make Australia a destination for original IP, just like Carmen, you've been doing in your field, in the film and TV field, we're going to have a really strong industry that's sustained for a long, long time. The great thing is that governments recognize this. Government recognize the jobs that you get from this industry. And there's quite a bit of investment going into not just rebates and incentives, but into infrastructure. I was at Docklands yesterday, the Docklands studio, and this new soundstage that's going up is fantastic for the industry in Victoria and in Australia. So I said, in terms of working across borders, the Hollywood's seen how great it is to make stuff here. They've seen the talent here, and I think they'll participate with our creators even more than they have in the past.
I mean, Andrew, I'd like to bring you on this because obviously your sector has always been global. You've always been looking, your audience has always been spread around the world. But what do you think we can, or in our other fields, what can we learn from that? But also, what do you think the opportunities are again for, how do we work better with your sector?
Yeah, you know, it's funny as I'm sitting here listening, and this is probably a far off opportunity, but you know, AI has meaningfully disrupted our industry, and you know, at some level, my sense is that it will disrupt, you know, the broader entertainment industry. But so when we go into a market, you know, we culturalize every product, so we don't make just one product for the world. Typically, on balance, most of the things that we create, you know, exist in a world with a set of characters and storylines and narratives that are fulfilled in moment-to-moment gameplay, and that might be entertainment-based, that might be sport-based. But if you're in Japan, your experience is going to be very different than if you're in Australia, and if you're in Germany, it's going to be very different than if you're in the UK, because we understand there's cultural sensibilities to entertainment that drive far deeper engagement. If the player identifies more meaningfully with the characters and the storylines that they're engaging with. And so we do that now on a geographic basis. As we think about the procedural creation of content over time using AI, it would not be unnatural 5 to 10 years from now in our content that it's not just geo-bound or cultural bound in terms of what you see and who you play with and who you interact with, but individualized. And it will understand me, I'm an Australian living in the US, and who my friends are and how and the things I'm interested in, and it will present me a set of characters that I will identify more with. And Graeme, you know, living in Australia and interacting with the different, you may get exactly the same storyline with a completely different set of characters, look and feel, names, titles, the whole thing. And so now entertainment is not kind of a build once, play everywhere. It's create this kind of sandbox with an underlying world, an underlying narrative, and then let the AI kind of play it out on an individual basis. You know, that's 5 to 10 years in our industry that will happen, where every single person who plays one of our games will ultimately get a personalized experience, not just in terms of from where they live, but who they are as an individual and who their friends are and how they like to play. As I think about the future of entertainment more broadly, and you've heard me say this before, which is, you know, the consumption of entertainment is moving from linear to interactive. I can imagine there's a world in the future where through some combination of unbelievable direction, unbelievable writing, unbelievable acting, and wrapped in AI, that film and television could be the same as we are, which is you see different things based on who you are and where you're viewing from and the things that you most identify with. And when I think about the future of entertainment and the ability to drive far deeper engagement with that entertainment, I think that's going to be a big opportunity for our industry and almost certainly for entertainment more broadly.
I think it's a brilliant segue, because one of the key things I wanted to touch on today with all of you was really the social, moral question of our times is inclusivity and representation on and off screens, whatever you're working on or whatever form you're working in. And for me, it's always made sense, not just morally, but it makes sense creatively and business, you know, because when I was a little kid growing up, if I didn't see a show that represented me on screen, then I had no choice. That's all there was. Whereas now, if I don't see me reflected, I'll go somewhere else. So, but I'm very keen, Sarah, your thoughts on how we all keep moving forward with this inclusivity and representation conversation to results, so we don't, our kids aren't having the same conversation again that we're having.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's become a business survival imperative. And by that, I mean, you know, we just talked about the level of competition for attention and how crowded the marketplace is. And so, you know, how do you make connections? How do you generate authentic emotional connections through storytelling, whether that's a game or whether it's a television show or a film or a social series or whatever that is. And when you look at it, and look, this is the white space that we created Hello Sunshine in, it just seems so dumb that, or just a crazy situation where you have an audience makeup. Just take American audiences or you take global audiences with a global streaming market. But at least if you just take women and men and then people of color, 51% women, if you look at the buying power, the purchasing power, the decision making around streaming services, they share media more frequently on social, all of those. And then if you take Hispanic audiences and African American audiences, and then if you look at who has been structurally included and excluded, or systemically included in the creation of media, 6% of female directors are women. You look at every structural green light committees, control, and what it is like a driving belief that if you authentically author stories, so that it's not about the representation on screen, but you're including people's lived experiences, you are going to produce better quality, you're going to produce better authentic storytelling. And that's the white space and the gap. And so, you know, we shouldn't be surprised that when we see a movie or a cut through, if you can think of a number of examples that have been blockbusters and everyone talks about, well, this is crazy. It's people seeing their actual lived experiences reflected on screen. And, you know, the end point of that is what Andrew so, you know, I mean, compellingly described then, right? And so it's not just the right thing to do, but it's business survival. If you want to be in business and connecting with audiences and consumers, whether a consumer products company or, you know, a media producer.
I mean, I do think it's interesting that obviously the areas gaming, all our YouTube work that we support is streets in front of what I would call the more traditional, older media forms. So Carmen, your views on the way that in your part of the sector this can move forward, this conversation on and off stage?
Yeah, I think Offstage is a very key point to talk about, Graeme. So, you know, as a company, we've been pretty committed to diverse casting on stage. And, you know, I think probably, you know, a recent example that's really elevated the conversation, of course, has been Hamilton, and fantastic that part of Hamilton's just incredible juggernaut of success. You know, I just have to wonder if a show like that would have done as well on Broadway, you know, a decade ago. Oh, well, I suppose it's already been open 5 years, but you know what I mean. So I think I love what Hamilton's done in terms of opening up people's hearts and minds to sort of taking more innovative risks. But, you know, it's a rally cry in the US that, I mean, that's permeated out to all of our company around the world. And I obviously agree deeply with Sarah and Greg about the commercial imperatives, you know, in addition to the moral imperative of it. But part of what we're being asked to consider is Offstage. So, you know, it's been pretty confronting, I'll say, to be doing audits of our behind the scene picture with management, stage management, crews, etc. I'm not surprised to see what they tell me. I mean, we've been very focused on female representation in the workplace. In fact, it's been a real passion of mine, auditing payroll, making sure there's not discrepancies in that regard. But I haven't really put that emphasis on the rest of the picture behind the scenes, and that's definitely the call on Broadway at the moment. So, you know, we've really made some very radical changes. It's been incredible actually to see how the industry's responded, you know, in the last year. I mean, we're about to engage a chief diversity officer. We're very much about making sure the conversation is really sitting at the most senior level of management, and that person is part of the most senior level of the executive team, and is there to not just guide, but to shape and hold everybody accountable in the organization. And that means looking at everything from recruitment practices, where we're trying to where we advertise, how we advertise, not just jobs for the boys, jobs for the mates. Oh, I'm going to actually replicate Moulin Rouge down in Australia. Hey, have you worked with any good associate directors there when you did show X or Y? Oh yeah, I had this really great person, and suddenly they're hired. So now we bring a lot more transparency to the process. I think we're probably behind where film and TV are in this regard as an industry, but I see the gains are really big and fast, and notwithstanding, we know it's a longer term issue to make real change. And I think the challenge with the workplaces opening up again is how we kind of bring this sentiment and passion and drive and just really carry it forward in a meaningful way in our return to the workplace.
So Greg, I think just your view on that too, like obviously, because why is Andrew's part of the sector and YouTube so in front of traditional film and telly in this space, creatively, culturally, commercially?
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that you and I have worked with is the Ron Howard Impact Program. And the Ron and Brian are both very aware of these sort of issues and are very inclusive. And the Impact Australia program, which we ran last year, is an incubator, an advanced incubator for writing, and accelerates development of scripts and stories. The thing that's really interesting about that is that we select everyone purely on merit, and in fact, all the applicants are read blind when they put their application in. And we had 1,300 applicants last year. They had to be Australian, from all over Australia, trying to get into 10 project spots. We ended up with 14 writers with 10 projects. And this process of just being based on merit meant that we ended up with something like 65% women, 28% non-white, 14% Indigenous, there was 28% gay, all in terms of when you're looking at inclusion, way outside the general population. And I'm not surprised about that in terms of the creative industries. But when we did that, we ended up being able to create 10 projects from completely diverse and very inclusive groups. And I think that's how you do that. I mean, I did come back to the fact that audiences, we have to make content that audiences want to see. Audiences don't want non-inclusive content anymore. That's actually what they want and what they'll pay for. So you have to, that's the commercial imperative of it. But I think there are ways and means of developing content and developing talent that if you do it based on merit, that's exactly what you get. You're going to get those outcomes. Now, we didn't know what outcome we would get. And frankly, we're a bit surprised to some extent. But I think that's how you do that. And you know, the old white men in the room still have a role being in the room. But part of our role is to lead and say, hey, this is okay. We can still run a business creating content that people want to see by being inclusive. I mean, that's what Hello Sunshine was set up on, the basis of being, you know, giving women who never had a voice in the industry, which is consumed more than 50% by women.
On that note, we've only got a few minutes left. I'm very keen to sort of wrap this up, but obviously we've talked about COVID a lot. And in my view, COVID impacted some people, particularly Carmen and Greg's traditional world, quite spectacularly because cinemas and theatres were shut. It also drove audiences to view differently in streaming. So part of Sarah's world, I mean, people were reading more than ever. People were viewing content on small screens more than ever. Andrew, massive uptick in games. What do you think the changes are from that are going to stick? What do you think COVID and this moment of all sitting on our sofas for a year and a bit, going forward, what is the stickability or the change that you think is going to come from this? So, Andrew?
Sure, I've given a couple of minutes and I want others to be able to weigh in as well. I'll try and be quick and succinct, which is human beings form habits over a 12-week process. We've been doing this for 12 months. And so I think these habits are going to stick in a fairly meaningful way. That doesn't mean people won't go back to cinemas, to Greg, or won't go back to Broadway shows. In fact, I would like to do both of those things as soon as possible. But there have certainly been habits formed. And these habits haven't been formed. It's not habits in the nature of addiction. It's habits in the nature of positive fulfillment of needs and motivations. And social interaction and creation and competition and self-improvement and inspiration, all reasons why people have come into games over the last 12 months, are really, really good for us as human beings. And now that more people than ever have found that across more games, across more platforms and more geographies, our expectation, certainly the trajectory of our industry, and as I start to think about my next fiscal year planning, it's not abating. It's not like people are going back to work and back to school and stopping fulfilling those motivations that they have through games. It will continue. I think they'll work this other stuff back into it, but our expectation is these trends and these habits that have formed over the last 12 months are going to be long-standing, and likely, we won't get the toothpaste back in that tube.
Sarah, your thoughts on coming out of this and what sticks in the future?
Oh, look, I just really echo Andrew's comments. I think there is an incredible appreciation and continued intention of how we spend our time. I think there's been a global re-examination of that, and when you're forced to spend time in certain ways, and I think there are some positive forming habits that, I think inherently certain things we used to do as individuals, or we'd go and experience things outside the home with our friends. There is this other place where we're in our home but experiencing content socially with each other. And and so I say, look, I think every media launch is launched into some form of cultural conversation, and so you're either part of shaping that or you're in it. And so I think the bar just is increasingly, it gets higher. I think there is a big roaring return to the experience economy, by the way. I mean, I really think theatres are going to come back in a huge way, but I do think there is this continued, you've got to do a lot to earn your way into an hour of someone's time. And I think that emotional, meeting real emotional needs with that, social connectivity, joy, all of those things. And so I think the competitive bar is continuing to raise, and I think that's really healthy for storytellers and others. And it does, I think, the importance of getting authenticity and storytelling right. And I mean, I think there are still real white spaces there, and I think we're in a global marketplace now, and I think we're just only in the first inning of really programming for global audiences on streaming services.
So Greg and Carmen,
one add I would make there, if I could, Graeme, if I just add one little thing, which is the other thing that's important to remember with millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha audiences, is 1 hour is not 1 hour anymore. What we could consume in an hour 10 years ago, or when we were 15 years old, my 9-year-old daughter can consume in 4 minutes, and will consume 17 things in an hour that would take me 3 days. So it's just the other thing to always remember is it's no longer a zero-sum game, because the very nature of consumption and the shifts in that consumption is both dramatic and extreme for this new generation of entertainment fans.
Greg, 30 seconds on what you think the shifts will be.
I think the shift is just greater access. It's theatres will come back big time, as everybody said, but it's as Sarah says, you've got to make your content available. I think it's great for the industry. I think it's because we're going to get more consumed, and it's just down to quality product. Make something that people want to see, know your audience.
And Carmen, again, from the position here in Australia where our cinemas and our live theatres are open, sorry America, but we're all working. Carmen, your final view on that?
Yeah, I think no doubt people, I think, generally have a newfound respect for the live experience and realise what they've really missed. I think there's a greater respect for artists and the whole ecosystem of freelancers behind them. And these are the people that are often drawn on to fundraise in catastrophes and crises like bushfires. I think there's also a greater recognition of the economic impact of live entertainment, restaurants, bars, international, interstate travel, tourism, etc., that sits around that whole experience of going out. And I do hope, with Australia seemingly poised to provide a roadmap at the moment, a lot of attention from Broadway and the West End about, well, how did Australia open and what does it mean to have audiences back in the theatre? How do you do that? It's lovely to think we've got that attention, and it very much reminds me of the Olympics when they happened in 2000 and the world was going, oh, actually Australia's pretty great, and you managed to put on a really great show. So that's great. And finally, I would say, I just hope this is more of a recognition for Australian government to invest more and look at investment incentives, tax incentives, etc., for live theatre and creation of live theatre here in a way that film and TV have had access to for many years, but we haven't. And I think we could be creating a lot more live content with more industry support in that way, because we see the benefits of it for Australian film and TV and their standing internationally. You know, we don't have Australian content quotas, like we have it radio, TV, film, we don't have it in theatre. And that would be a hope of mine out of this experience.
Thank you all very much. We're just 1 minute over, but I'm going to throw to Erin Gray from the AAA to wrap us up. But thank you very much, Greg, Carmen, Andrew and Sarah. It's been really interesting.
Thank you, Graeme. And wow, thank you to all the amazing panelists. I mean, what a interesting and engaging conversation. I feel like my head's going to explode thinking about what entertainment's going to look like in just a few years. It's really such a dynamic and changing industry. So anyway, on behalf of the AAA and Good Day USA, I thank all of you for joining us today. You know, we are so proud to be able to host these virtual events and bring together the brightest minds from the US and Australia, you know, have these shared ideas and conversations and strengthen the strong ties between our two countries. I think today's conversation really highlighted the fantastic opportunities for collaboration in this, you know, really quickly changing, exciting and dynamic industry. I'd also like to thank the state of New South Wales for their support and for hosting our pre-session today. And let everyone know that you can find the recording of today's event on our website, along with past webinars and information on future events. And the website is AmericanAustralian.org. So thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you at a future event, and with any luck, in person at a future event very soon. Thank you.